I never planned to tell this story. For years I tried to bury it, to convince myself that what happened on my mission was just a trial of faith, something everyone went through, something that would eventually make sense. But the truth is that nothing about it ever stopped haunting me. The nights I spent awake in North Carolina still cling to me like humidity in the summer air, sticking to my skin no matter how many times I try to wipe it away. And maybe the only way to finally breathe again is to let the truth come out. So here I am saying the words I never thought I'd say out loud. My mission, President's secret rule, broke me, and I can't keep pretending it didn't happen. My name is Ethan Miller. I grew up in Provo, Utah, where the mountains feel like guardians and the church feels like the center of the universe. My family is the kind that appears in missionary-themed calendars, clean-cut sons in white shirts, smiling mothers in modest dresses, fathers who speak like they're auditioning for general conference. The Millers served. It was what we did. My grandfather had served in Argentina, my father in Chicago, my older brother in Brazil. The walls of our home were covered in framed pictures of missionaries holding scriptures near temples, like a museum of righteousness. From a young age, I knew what was expected of me. Serving a mission wasn't a question. It was a prophecy spoken over my life. I was raised on early morning seminary, youth activities on weeknights, and sacrament meetings where everyone whispered about which missionary had just returned and which young man would be next. I breathed obedience like air. When my mission call finally came, "You are hereby called to serve in the North Carolina Raleigh mission," my parents cried like I'd been accepted into heaven. My dad hugged me so tightly I could smell the cologne he wore only on Sundays. My mom held my face in her hands and whispered, "You're going to be a leader. I feel it." I smiled, but my stomach tightened. I don't know why. Maybe a part of me sensed what was coming. In the MTC, everything was a blur of forced enthusiasm. Teachers telling us that exact obedience brings miracles, companions watching each other like pretend angels with clipboards, schedules so rigid they made me forget what real silence felt like. I kept waiting for the spiritual high everyone promised I'd get. But instead I felt like I was walking deeper into a tunnel that kept getting narrower. I told myself it was normal. Everyone struggled the first few weeks. Right? But that feeling didn't go away. Not when I boarded the plane to Raleigh. Not when I stepped into the thick, wet heat of the Carolina summer. Not even when I met the other missionaries. Something about the air felt heavier there, like the sky pressed down a little harder. Our first meeting as new missionaries took place in a chapel that smelled faintly of mildew and old hymn books. The carpets were worn, the lights flickered a little, and everyone sat unusually straight in their chairs. It wasn't the nervous excitement I had expected. It was something closer to quiet fear. Then the mission president walked in. President Dalton looked like he'd stepped out of a leadership magazine. Tall, suit perfectly fitted, hair graying in a way that made him appear authoritative rather than old. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. He scanned the room slowly, like he was reading each missionary's soul, to see whether we would obey him without question. "Welcome to the Lord's battlefield," he said. "In this mission, obedience is not just the first law, it is the only law." The only law. The phrase felt like a stone dropped inside my chest. Other missions talked about love, service, understanding people, connecting with the community. But President Dalton didn't mention any of that. He talked about discipline, sacrifice, and structure. He repeated the phrase, complete emotional consecration, several times, and I remember wondering what that even meant. A few missionaries shifted uncomfortably, like they'd heard this speech before and dreaded it. After the meeting, I noticed some older missionaries whispering by the hallway, their eyes darting toward President Dalton's office door. When they noticed me looking, they scattered like kids caught somewhere they shouldn't be. That was the first moment I sensed that something in this mission was deeply off. The feeling only grew stronger when I met my first companion, Elder Thompson. He was quiet, almost too quiet. When I asked basic questions, "Where are you from? How long have you been out?" He gave short, neutral answers like he was reading off a script, and whenever I tried to talk about anything personal, anything even slightly emotional, he'd change the subject or pretend not to hear me. I thought maybe he just didn't like me, or maybe he was shy. But then I noticed the way he flinched every time we passed the mission office, or when the phone buzzed with a message from the zone leaders. He walked like someone constantly bracing for impact. It took only a few days before I understood why. My interview with President Dalton came at the end of our first week. His office felt too cold, the air conditioner blasting even though the hallways outside were warm and humid. He gestured for me to sit, folding his hands in front of him like a judge preparing to speak. "Elder Miller," he said, "I've heard you're a good missionary, disciplined, from a strong family. I expect great things from you." I should have felt proud, but his tone wasn't complimentary. It was possessive. Then he leaned forward. "In this mission, we have a special rule, a sacred rule. It is not written in the handbook because it is higher than the handbook." My stomach tightened. "No missionary," he continued, "is allowed to have personal conversations with their companion. No sharing feelings, no emotional discussions, no fears, no stories about home, no struggles, nothing that creates emotional dependency." I stared at him, confused. "But companions are supposed to support each other." He smiled, slow and cold. "Support comes from obedience, not from emotional entanglement." I swallowed hard. "Sir, why is this rule necessary?" His eyes sharpened. "Because emotions make missionaries weak, and I will not have weak missionaries." Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. More like a quiet, invisible fracture running through the center of who I thought I was. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. As I walked out of his office, the hallway seemed darker than before. The air felt heavier, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone, even standing a few feet from another missionary. That night, Elder Thompson lay stiffly in his bed, staring at the ceiling while cicadas screamed outside our apartment window. I wanted to ask him about the rule, about how long it had been in place, about how he was dealing with all of this. But the fear in his eyes earlier that day kept me silent. I rolled onto my side, clutching my pillow like it could anchor me to something real. I wanted to pray, but the words felt empty. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there, listening to my heartbeat thudding too loudly in my ears, wondering how long a person could go without speaking their truth before something inside them collapses entirely. I didn't know it yet, but that collapse was already beginning. The days that followed felt like living inside a bubble made of glass, thin enough for every sound to echo, but thick enough to keep me completely isolated. I tried to distract myself with the routine, waking up at 6:30, companionship prayer that felt mechanical, cold showers because our apartment water heater was broken, and the long bike rides through humid North Carolina streets lined with pine trees and red clay. Everything smelled like wet earth and asphalt, like the world was sweating with us. Each day I kept waiting for a moment when things would start to feel normal, when the mission would begin to feel like the spiritual journey everyone had promised. But instead, every hour felt heavier. Every silence felt like a command. Every breath felt like something I had to earn. I started noticing things I hadn't seen at first. Missionaries avoided eye contact with one another in meetings. Companions walked together physically, but lived miles apart emotionally. When someone laughed too loudly or told a story about home, conversations would suddenly stop, and a quiet tension would settle over the room. It was as if everyone was terrified of crossing some invisible line. One morning, as we studied scriptures side by side at our small apartment table, I tried to break the silence. "Thompson," I said, "do you ever feel overwhelmed?" He didn't even look up. "We're not supposed to talk about feelings." I exhaled slowly. "I know, but..." His jaw tightened. Please don't put me in that position. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because he was harsh, but because he sounded scared. There was something deeply unnatural about the way he resisted connection, like a reflex trained through fear. Every companionship study felt like two strangers performing a duet they'd never rehearsed, pretending the notes made sense. One night, as we were walking back to our bikes after a long, unsuccessful day of tracting, I asked quietly, "Have you ever talked to the president about the rule?" His reaction startled me. He stopped walking and stared straight ahead, shoulders frozen. "Don't ask me things like that," he whispered. Not out loud. The streetlight above us flickered. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Thompson kept staring into the distance like he was afraid the trees themselves were listening. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't just a strict rule. It was a system of fear. That fear only became more real after what happened with Elder Ramirez. Ramirez was part of our district, a missionary from Arizona, with an easy smile and a habit of humming hymns under his breath. He wasn't particularly bold, but he was kind, genuinely kind, the kind of person who asked how your day was and actually waited for the answer. One evening during district council, I noticed Ramirez seemed different. He kept rubbing his forehead, tapping his foot, glancing around the room nervously. His companion, Elder Jensen, sat stiffly beside him, eyes red like he hadn't slept. After the meeting ended, I went to talk to Ramirez, but before I could reach him, the zone leaders pulled him aside. They spoke in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Ramirez's expression shift. First confusion, then fear, then resignation. The next morning, he was gone. No goodbye, no transfer announcement, no explanation. When I asked our district leader where Ramirez went, he lowered his voice and said, "He broke the rule." He opened up to his companion. "Someone told the president." Someone told. Two words that made my stomach turn. That night, Thompson barely touched his dinner. He pushed spaghetti around his plate like he was rearranging guilt, not food. "What happened to Ramirez?" I finally asked. He swallowed hard. "They sent him home, or somewhere. I don't know. Nobody knows." "But why?" Thompson leaned in, voice trembling. "Because talking about what you feel makes you a problem, and problems get removed." The room felt smaller after he said that, like the walls were inching closer. I remember lying in bed later, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whir of our old fan spinning slowly like a tired confession. Something inside me was crying out, but I kept swallowing the sound. A few days later, during our weekly planning session, I broke. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way. More like a slow leak finally turning into a crack. I kept making mistakes, writing the wrong goals, losing track of time, forgetting which family we were supposed to visit. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. The air felt too heavy to breathe. "Are you okay?" Thompson whispered. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I'm fine, the way missionaries are trained to do. But the words slipped out of me before I could stop them. "I'm not okay," I said. "I feel like I'm losing myself." Thompson froze, his eyes filled with panic, not compassion. "Elder," he whispered, "you can't say things like that. Please." "I have to tell someone," I said, voice cracking. "I can't keep going like this. If the president finds out, I don't care." But that wasn't true. I cared. I cared so much it hurt. I cared about disappointing my family, about being labeled rebellious, about being sent home in shame. But I cared even more about the truth bubbling inside me, the truth I'd been suffocating for weeks. Thompson got up and paced the room like a caged animal. Then he lowered his head into his hands. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If you talk, you won't just get in trouble. You'll get punished." "Punished how?" He hesitated for a long time. Too long. "I've seen it," he finally said. "Interviews that last hours, companions separated, leaders reassigned, Missionaries sent home without explanation. Letters to families with different stories. Different stories. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to you?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. The silence between us felt like a confession. For the first time since arriving in North Carolina, I realized that the mission wasn't just about preaching the gospel. It was about control, silence, obedience at the cost of humanity. That night, while Thompson slept restlessly, mumbling in his dreams, I sat at my desk staring at my scriptures. My hands shook so badly that the pages rustled like dry leaves. I didn't know what to pray for. Strength? Clarity? Escape? All I knew was that something inside me was shifting. A small thread of truth tugging against the knot of fear. A sense that if I didn't do something, say something, I would disappear into the same void that swallowed Ramirez. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like I was borrowing air from a world I no longer belonged to, and deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The morning everything changed didn't arrive with thunder or some dramatic storm. It came quietly on an ordinary Tuesday, wrapped in the same pale Carolina sunlight that slipped through our apartment blinds every day. But I woke up with a weight in my chest so heavy, it felt like I'd swallowed a stone in my sleep. I couldn't shake it. Every movement felt slow, like I was moving through thick water instead of air. Thompson noticed something was wrong even before I spoke. He watched me as we got dressed, his eyes darting to me in the mirror like he was afraid to ask. When we knelt for companionship prayer, my voice cracked halfway through. I tried to hide it, but he heard. I knew he did. We stepped outside, the air sticky and warm even though it was barely 8 a.m. I remember the way the humidity clung to my skin, how the cicadas were already screaming from the trees, how the street smelled faintly of wet grass and old pavement. Everything felt too real and not real at the same time, like I was walking inside a dream I didn't want to have. We biked to our first appointment, but I couldn't focus. The world around me blurred, the passing cars, the houses with their vinyl siding, the American flags hanging from porches. People talked to us, but I barely heard their words. It felt like my mind was drifting somewhere behind me, dragging my body along like dead weight. At lunch, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. They were trembling again. I didn't want them to tremble. I wanted them to obey me. But they didn't. Thompson stood in the doorway. "Ethan," he whispered, dropping the missionary formality for the first time in weeks. "You're scaring me." I swallowed hard. I don't know what's happening to me. He shut the door softly, like he didn't want the walls to hear. Then he sat at the foot of my bed and whispered, "You need help." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "What kind of help? We're not allowed to talk to anyone." "We're supposed to talk to the president," he said, but his voice was flat, like he didn't believe it himself. I shook my head. "I don't trust him." Thompson looked down at his hands. "None of us do." That admission hit me harder than anything else had so far. He said it with the kind of quiet despair that doesn't come from one bad day. It comes from months of carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. Before I could respond, the phone buzzed. Thompson's face went pale when he saw the caller ID. "It's the zone leaders," he said. He answered. "Hello? Yes, he's here." "Okay." He hung up slowly. "They want us at the mission office in an hour." My stomach twisted. "Why?" They didn't say. We both knew what that meant. The bike ride to Raleigh was torture. Every pedal felt like it was dragging me toward something inevitable. I felt like the ground was pulling me closer with every turn of the wheel, like the air was getting thicker, like even the sky was watching me. When we arrived at the mission office, a cold breeze hit us as soon as we walked in. The air conditioning was always too high, almost aggressively cold, as if the building itself needed to remind us who was in control. The receptionist didn't smile. She never smiled. She just nodded toward the hall where President Dalton's door was half open, a sliver of darkness visible inside. Thompson squeezed my arm before we separated. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Don't fight him. Just get through it." I nodded, though my legs felt like they were made of sand. When I stepped into the president's office, he didn't invite me to sit. He stood behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back, staring at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. The blinds were drawn, leaving the room dim except for the harsh fluorescent light above his head. "Elder Miller," he said finally, "I'm disappointed." The words cut deep, sharper than anger would have. "I hear you've been showing signs of emotional instability," he continued. "And worse, you've been creating emotional situations with your companion." He raised a hand. "Do not speak unless I ask you to." My mouth snapped shut. "Do you understand why we have rules in this mission?" he asked. I forced myself to nod. "Say it." My throat tightened. "To help us be obedient?" His eyes narrowed. "No, to help you be consecrated." I didn't know what to say to that. He stepped closer, stopping directly in front of me. I could smell his aftershave, sharp like pine needles. "You are not here to form bonds. You are not here to express weakness. You are here to become an instrument." The word instrument made something inside me recoil. Instruments don't feel. They don't think. They don't question. They are used. "I expect absolute discipline from you," he said. "Your family expects it. The Lord expects it." That sentence hit like a punch to the chest. My family. He knew exactly where to strike. "Now," he said, walking back around his desk, "tell me about your emotional expressions." My jaw tightened. I've been stressed." "That is not an emotional expression. Try again." My heart pounded. I felt overwhelmed. "Why?" His voice was too sharp, too precise. Like each word was designed to peel me apart slowly. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The truth was too tangled, too heavy, and something in me knew that no matter what I said, it would be used against me. President Dalton sighed. "You are resisting. Resistance reveals pride." "I'm not resisting." "You're lying." The room spun slightly. I felt my palms sweating, my breathing becoming shallow. "You will not speak to your companion about this," he said. "Do you understand?" I nodded. "You will not write about this." I nodded again. "You will not dwell on this." Another nod. "And you will not cry about this." My eyes stung, betraying me. The president's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Weakness is the doorway to darkness, Elder Miller. If you let these emotions grow, they will consume your mission and your soul." I felt something inside me collapse. Not a dramatic break, more like a dimming, a quiet extinguishing of something sacred. A belief. A hope. A piece of myself I hadn't realized was fragile. He dismissed me with a flick of his hand. When I stepped back into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed above me, louder than before, like an alarm only I could hear. Thompson was waiting near the exit. One look at my face and he knew. "We need to go," he whispered. And we did. But no matter how far we biked, no matter how fast we moved, I couldn't outrun the feeling that something irreversible had happened in that office. That a line had been crossed, not by me, but by him. And the weight of that realization settled into my bones, heavy and cold like winter arriving too early. The weeks after that interview were some of the darkest of my life. Something in me had shifted, so quietly that no one else could see it, but violently enough that I could feel the fracture every time I breathed. I kept doing the missionary routine, waking up at 6:30, praying, studying, knocking on doors, teaching lessons, but none of it felt connected to who I was anymore. It was like my body was still in North Carolina, but my mind had taken 2 steps back from reality, watching everything from a distance. Thompson tried to keep things normal. He smiled more than usual, forced small talk during meals, hummed hymns while ironing his shirt, anything to create an illusion of safety. But the fear never left his eyes. He walked carefully, spoke carefully, even breathed carefully. Like one wrong move could trigger an explosion none of us could survive. One night, about a week after the interview, I woke up gasping for air. Not because of a nightmare, because I felt nothing. No sadness, no fear, no anger, just emptiness. A hollow silence in the deepest part of me. I sat up, gripping my sheets, trying to force myself to feel something, anything. But the numbness held on like a cold hand around my heart. I stood up quietly and walked to the living room. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the faint buzz of a streetlight outside. I sat on the floor, pressing my back against the couch, and stared at the ceiling. The shadows from the blinds made thin lines across the room like bars on a cage. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard footsteps behind me. Thompson stepped into the room, half asleep, rubbing his eyes. When he saw me on the floor, he froze. "Ethan," he whispered, "what's going on?" I looked at him, and the words came out before I could stop them. "I don't know who I am anymore." He swallowed, visibly shaken. Then he sat beside me, knees pulled to his chest. I think I know what you mean." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was the first time we weren't pretending. The first time the silence wasn't oppressive. It was honest. And then he said something I will never forget. "Ethan, I think this rule is destroying all of us." He wasn't supposed to say that. Missionaries weren't supposed to admit weakness or fear or truth. But hearing it, hearing another human voice acknowledge what I'd been drowning in, felt like a tiny crack of light breaking through a thick wall. We talked quietly for the first time since arriving in North Carolina. Not long, not deeply, not freely, but enough. Enough to feel human again. Enough to remember that I wasn't crazy. Enough to remember that suffering in silence was never holy. The next morning, neither of us mentioned the conversation. We didn't dare. But something between us had shifted. We moved in sync again. We taught lessons with more sincerity. We checked on each other with the kind of subtle care you develop in war zones. Small, discreet gestures that keep you alive. But the damage had already been done. 2 months later, I got sick. Not physically sick, emotionally sick. My nerves were shot. My thoughts bounced around like a trapped fly. My chest tightened during prayer, during lessons, even during meals. Some days I couldn't eat. Some days I couldn't sleep. Some days I couldn't think. I hid it as long as I could. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to disappoint my family. I didn't want to be the failure everyone whispered about in the hallways. But one morning, while teaching a woman in a small trailer park outside of Garner, my mind went blank mid-sentence. Completely blank. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The woman stared at me. Thompson stared at me. The room tilted, and the next thing I knew, I was outside, leaning over a railing, sobbing into my hands. I couldn't breathe. Thompson called the mission nurse. She called the president. And within 3 days, I was on a plane back to Utah. My family met me at the airport with posters, tears, and forced optimism. "You served with honor," they said. "The Lord needed you home," they said. "You should be proud," they said. No one knew the truth. I didn't tell them. I couldn't. Not yet. For months after returning home, I carried the mission like a locked box inside my chest. I tried to move on. I took classes at BYU. I went on dates. I smiled when people asked about my mission and gave the same safe answer every returned missionary learns to give. It was hard, but I grew a lot. But every night when the world went quiet, the truth sat with me like an unwelcome guest. The fear, the silence, the rule. President Dalton's voice telling me emotions were weakness. Ramirez disappearing. Thompson whispering in the dark that he was scared too. the version of me that broke so quietly no one noticed. One night, while sitting alone in my car outside a grocery store parking lot, I finally broke open. The tears came suddenly, violently, like a flood that had waited too long. And when they stopped, something inside me felt different. Not healed, not whole, but awake. I realized then that everything I'd been taught about obedience had twisted into something else, something more like surrendering my mind than strengthening my spirit. I began writing in a journal. At first, just a few sentences a day, then pages, then entire nights. I wrote about the rule, about what it did to us, about the slow unraveling of our humanity. I wrote until the truth didn't feel poisonous anymore. Months later, I reached out to Thompson. We met in a small cafe in Salt Lake, both of us awkward and nervous at first. But when we sat down, he exhaled deeply, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally see him. I left the church, he said quietly. I couldn't stay after what happened. I nodded. I'm not sure where I am yet. We talked for hours, not like missionaries, not like former companions, but like two survivors finally comparing scars. Before we left, he said something that stayed with me long after I walked out of that cafe. You know, when something tries to control every part of you, eventually a part of you fights back, even if it has to break first. That sentence didn't fix everything, but it lit something inside me. Something warm, something honest, something that felt like the beginning of a new kind of faith. Not faith in an institution, but faith in my own mind, my own intuition, my own ability to heal. And that's why I'm telling this story now. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because someone out there is still in a mission apartment, sitting on the edge of a bed at 6 a.m., wondering why they feel like they're disappearing. Someone is being told their emotions make them unworthy. Someone is suffering in silence because a rule, one that never should have existed, is crushing the one thing that makes them human. If that someone is listening, you are not weak. You are not broken. You are not alone. And if this story resonated with you, I hope you'll leave a comment below and share your experience. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you'd like to support stories like this, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description and the pinned comment, only if you feel called to. Before I end, here's the truth I wish someone had told me when I was 19. When a system demands your silence, breaking that silence isn't rebellion. It's the beginning of becoming whole again.